Hello, welcome everyone to our Innovations in Tobacco Control lecture series. My name is Joanna Cohn. I'm director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I'm so excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Raglan Maddox from the Bagumani Modewa clan from Papua New Guinea. Dr. Maddox did his Bachelor of Science degree in MPH at Curtin University in Perth, Australia, then his PhD at the University of Canberra in Australia, and is currently a senior fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. In addition to his training and current positions in Australia, Dr. Maddox has worked in Geneva, in Toronto, Canada, and in Oxford in England. Dr. Maddox's program of research has focused on developing and analyzing population-based Indigenous health information systems using community-driven processes, focusing on commercial tobacco use. And this work has been generating not only primary data platforms, but also returning data to Indigenous communities to help better understand and improve Indigenous health and well-being. I'll say that in addition to Dr. Maddox's current position, he's also chair of the Racial Equity Working Group of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. And in 2023, he led a diverse group of authors in publishing a paper in the journal Tobacco Control on ethical publishing in Indigenous communities, which he'll be talking about today. He's also addressed really important issues in his publications, including how the FCTC has done vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples, how well progress has been made, and a very great, interesting thought piece on the PMI's Foundation for a Smoke-Free World in relation to healthy Indigenous populations. So I'm really excited to hear Dr. Maddox's sharing with us about Indigenous excellence, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in research and publishing. So Raglan Maddox, over to you.
Thanks, Joanna, and nice to be with you all this morning. Sorry, I sort of hesitate to say this morning because it's, I guess it's morning in Australia in some ways. It's about 12:30 at night, so I feel like saying good morning and good evening rings equally true. But thanks for joining us today, and thanks for the warm introduction. It's also nice to reflect, I guess, on the program of work and the work that we've been doing in tobacco control, sort of reflecting on where we've come from, but also where we're going as a community and how we can advance science, I guess, to improve health and well-being for all populations, which is, I guess, the essence of what we'll be talking about today. As you mentioned, I'm Raglan Maddox. I come from the Bagumani and Modewa clan in Papua New Guinea, and I'll introduce myself in a minute. But before I do, I did want to acknowledge Jasmine Sarin, who's a Gamilaroi woman and has done this bit of artwork for us that you'll see throughout the PowerPoint presentation today. And I wanted to pause on this for a minute because I think it unpacks the principles of which the program I'm lucky enough to lead is established. And so the element or the meeting that you can see on the bottom right-hand side of our first slide there, the title slide, is an image representing the health and well-being of the community at the centre. Around the outside, you have community members upholding the health and well-being of the community. It is a national program, so you have colours from the landscapes across Australia. So you have the blues and greens of the Torres Strait, which I'll speak about, right through to the ochres of the Central Australian desert. And so I thought it's a nice way to start is just to touch on that principle, I guess, or that foundation as we sort of come together virtually today to look at the health and wellbeing of our communities. As I mentioned, I did want to talk a little bit about who I am and where I come from. And one of the reasons for this is because it shapes everything we do in terms of developing research, how we come to know things, how we work in terms of the research we undertake, the principles that we adhere to and other things. And I did want to acknowledge I'm calling in from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, Australia, the nation's capital. And acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm dialing in from, but also the traditional owners of lands around the world on which we all come from. As I mentioned, this is probably an interesting snapshot. The map in the back is the map of what is now Papua New Guinea, but was at the time the territory of New Guinea and the territory of Papua, which was part of Australia or governed as part of Australia up until 1975 when Papua New Guinea became independent. One of the reasons I like to highlight this slide is because depending if I was born in 1975 or after, would influence our relationship to a whole range of programs and policies or government programs and policies that changes our relationship with the commercial tobacco industry and programs and policies that influence commercial tobacco use that I wanted to talk about today. And then the map at the front is sort of the map that we have today. Now, as you can see, Papua New Guinea is sort of independent to Australia, but Australia's closest neighbour. And I'm from a small place called Bonabona, and you can sort of see that big black arrow to the southeast tip of Papua New Guinea. And you can see the blues and greens, I guess, of similar to the Torres Strait in that photo down the bottom right. So a tourism brochure almost, or a postcard of a jetty just outside of Bonabona in Milne Bay, where my sister recently renewed her vows. Above that, I have a photo of my mother and my uncle actually at boarding school at the mission school in Quato. And I think it's really important to sort of recognise the generation before me for a number of reasons, including the opportunities that we have today that weren't available to them. And so the photo there reminds me of the experiences my mother had growing up in what was at the time a territory of Australia, and the types of educational policies that meant my mother was discouraged from speaking her native language Sual at school. So maybe a little anecdote around how the different structures or the policies have changed over time. My mother used to have to do manual labour and carry sand up and down a mountain on the island as punishment if she was ever caught speaking her native language and her mother tongue. And now today she has the privilege, I guess, to teach the same language at the university. So it's amazing how quickly times can change and how quickly the education system or the academy can change. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and how we can support those sort of structural changes to be more inclusive within, in this instance, publishing or research or whatever role that you may have in the academy. We can fast forward a few years from my mother at the mission school to a recent photo of myself and my family in Papua New Guinea. And this is a photo where we were supporting my nephew to play basketball. I think we're playing against Samoa at the time. And so you can see my nieces at the front of the photo and then myself in the middle and my siblings in the back of this image right through to the generation before me. And the reason I like to highlight this is for a couple of reasons. I guess Indigenous people are diverse. There are many Indigenous people around the world, and we are constantly evolving. But it's a reminder that in this game, and I try not to reflect on it too much, because in this game we actually lost to Samoa in the Pacific Nations Cup. And my nephew fouled out with a couple of minutes to go, and Papua New Guinea ended up losing by 6 points. But the reason I like to reflect on that is because while I was disappointed he fouled out, and probably even more disappointed that we lost, I think there's an important teaching there about taking on the game and trying to advance the game, or change the momentum and make sure that there was an impact that he played in this game. And I think there's some important lessons for us in the academy, and particularly in tobacco control, about trying to change the narrative or focus the narrative in a direction that we would like to be going. In this instance, and the sort of measures that we look at are around having healthy, thriving communities that are free from addiction. And then on the right-hand side, we've got an image which reflects sort of our understanding of health and well-being. It also speaks to our relationship with everything that living is innate to us. So, for example, a bird of paradise, a feather, a plume activates a metamorphosis within us, and thus we become the living embodiment of the living environment. And so I think that fundamental understanding of health and well-being as an Indigenous person can be quite different in different contexts. I think the definition of health within our communities is along the lines of the physical, mental, spiritual and emotional health of not only the individual, but the community. It also looks at things like health of the environment. And so I think it's really important that we look at some of those foundations when we're undertaking research, because they can be quite different, especially if we start to look at, for example, health programs and policies, or we look at tobacco control and the role that has in health, or the determinants of health. And so we'll speak to that a little bit throughout today's session. And why do we do that, and why do I make that point? I think it's a nice example and a nice tangible example, because generally Euro-Western ways of thinking and conducting research currently dominate contemporary research. They've predominantly suppressed Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, and can lead to unsafe research design, conduct and analysis practices that marginalise or oppress Indigenous peoples and knowledges. We know that that the academy has hierarchy. We know that that there are scientific hierarchies. We know that the type of work we do is inherently political. We might like to think that our research is objective, but we know that it is influenced by a whole range of factors that we may or may not be aware of. So the political environment, what's funded, what isn't funded, the challenges that we have in doing the research that we undertake. And if we reflect over the last 5 years or so, things like the COVID pandemic and other things will influence our research and policies, research programs and policies. Things like meta-analysis, random controlled trials, RCTs, and other things also influence programs and policies in different ways and hold values that might be different to, for example, natural observations or other types of research. And so I wanted to really bring this to the fore and remind us that that regardless if we want to have a hierarchical society or not, there are inherently hierarchies in science. And it's really important that we're aware of those hierarchies, not only to improve our science, but to continue to improve, hopefully, society. I also wanted to highlight a little bit of work by Vernon Arkey, who's a prominent Aboriginal artist, and the piece of work he did called Ostracism. And this is you would have seen the link there, and I'm sure these slides will be available. But it's a nice way to visualise, I'm not sure if nice is the right word, but it is one way to visualise different ways that society shapes the way we think, what types of knowledge is socialised and accepted. And so you can see in this image of this bit of work by Vernon Arkey that it says, "I'm not racist, but," and it gives a whole range of predominantly microaggressions or racist examples. So I don't know why Aboriginal people can't look after their houses properly. I'm not racist, but Aboriginal people weren't doing anything with the land before we came, and I'm not racist, and it goes on and on. And I'm sure wherever you are, there are probably examples that you've heard or experienced that speak to that type of conversation or that type of narrative that we see from time to time, or we might see more commonly in different spaces. And so it's trying to bring that to the fore so that we recognise the types of influences that have in our science. We also know that there is scientific segregation, and I sort of want to speak a little bit about colonisation. I explained at the start of this sort of where I come, who I am, where I come from. And one of the reasons for this is because it does shape the way I see the world and my understanding of the world. And so we know that up until the 1960s, for instance, in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were excluded from the academic education system, the Euro-Western academic education system. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had first graduate in the 1960s, and similar for Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea we had our first universities established in the 1960s as well, and our first graduates, and that rolls out in different ways. We also know that transgenerational experiences of education system are different as well. I sort of spoke about my mother going to boarding school as a child, and her experience with the education system. She was lucky enough to go to university, but didn't go on to do graduate studies or other things. And similar, my siblings, I'm the youngest of three. Both of my siblings went to university, but didn't go on to do graduate studies. And so I want to highlight that that sort of intergenerational experiences, the intergenerational wealth that comes with exposure to universities, influences not only our experiences within those spaces, but also influences whose voices have been heard in the literature and whose voices are, published in peer review at this stage. And so being aware of that type of segregation can be very important in understanding the weight of evidence and where the evidence base is situated. I also wanted to acknowledge and sort of celebrate, actually, I'll take a moment to acknowledge the work of Lisa Hilly, who's a Papua New Guinean woman, and she's doing her PhD at the moment at the Australian National University. But she's really celebrating some of the monumental women that have helped shape particularly Papua New Guinea. And so she, in this piece, Lisa Hilly is celebrating the work of Dame Meg Taylor, who was one of Papua New Guinea's first graduates, but she graduated from the University of Melbourne and went on to support Sir Michael Somare as an advisor and lead Papua New Guinea into independence. But not only was she one of the first to graduate, she's someone that we don't necessarily hear much about or see or celebrate much of, given the amount of work that she's done and the work that she's been acknowledged for. And so I think the other thing I wanted to try and highlight throughout today's presentation is around the role that power and privilege has played in giving people voice or otherwise. And so I did want to acknowledge both the work of Meg Taylor, but also Lisa Hilly in acknowledging and celebrating that and giving it voice. Which leads us nicely into this wheel of power and privilege, which I suspect many of you have seen. And I must also highlight that it is context specific. So at different times, we may have different types of power and privilege. I, as you heard this morning, have had the privilege of going to a range of different academic institutions, including places like Oxford. In the UK, I come with male privilege. I have letters after my name that speak to my academic credentials and mean that I have a fairly well-paying job. I have stable housing, income, all those sorts of things that tend to make it easier for me to experience good health outcomes. But depending on the context, that male privilege may be beneficial or otherwise. I suspect if I was having an interaction with some sort of security or police agency or something like that, sometimes I might not necessarily want my male privilege. So it is context specific, but again, useful to acknowledge whenever we're doing work that who we are, where we come from, comes with different privileges and different balance of power. And so it's a useful tool to look at and to reflect on how it can shape our research. So I've crammed 60,000 years into this slide. So we know in Australia that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been actively living here and celebrating culture for over 60,000 years. And we know that that prior to colonisation, we didn't necessarily have the same type of engagement with the commercial tobacco industry. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were paid in rations of flour, sugar, tea and tobacco up until the late 1960s. And as a result, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience high rates of smoking prevalence, but as Indigenous people, that's a fairly common story for a range of reasons, including those structural determinants of health that impact health outcomes, but also impact whether or not people smoke or not. And so I've highlighted a number of areas here that I wanted to try and touch upon. And I don't expect you to be able to go over or read all the data in this slide, but just to touch on a couple of important points. So obviously this year is an important year, 60 years since the 1964 US Surgeon General report that highlighted the impact of smoking. Since that point, we continue to learn about the harms of commercial tobacco use. In Australia, we've seen plain text health warnings on cigarette packets. We've seen the phasing out of advertising in the 1970s, increased penalty to sales of minors and other things. But as I mentioned, the exclusion from the education system up until the 1960s means the evidence base is predominantly Euro-Western, non-Indigenous focused. We have had plenty to celebrate. We had the first World Conference on Tobacco or Health in 1990 that had an Indigenous stream and spoke to the importance of being smoke-free as Indigenous peoples. We also saw in that period widespread smoke-free policies. We had bans in smoking in public places. We had NRT patches approved for sale in the 90s, changes to minimum age and other things that have influenced our relationship with tobacco. And then more recently, up in the 2010s, we started to see the first Indigenous specific smoking programs or tobacco control programs roll out for and by Indigenous people. Again, giving Indigenous peoples some more power, the ability to determine what smoking programs and policies look like, how they support communities to be smoke-free, not only quitting smoking, but also preventing uptake. We saw plain packaging and the implementation of other things come in, and then obviously COVID-19 more recently, which has disrupted the way we work, but also we've seen things like the National Tobacco Strategy being implemented to include areas to ensure Indigenous voices in that space. And then on the flip side of that, we've seen that the tobacco industry continue to target Indigenous peoples. And while we're speaking of Indigenous people specifically today, it's not just Indigenous peoples that the industry has targeted, but I have included an example here where Philip Morris were promoting e-cigarettes to Aboriginal medical service, to Aboriginal corporations around Australia in 2019. And while this is a fairly simple letter, we know that this continues to happen with retail outlets focused in sort of Indigenous communities and other places. We know that even late last year that there was ongoing targeting with letters and promotion of e-cigarettes following the referendum that was held in Australia around the voice to Parliament and Indigenous voice to Parliament. So we know that these work continues to shape our society and to give voice to certain or privileged voices of certain organisations, but also undermines the voices of Indigenous peoples. And so how we operate in this space is really important, and the values and principles that we come to operate in. In saying that, I think sometimes we have to think about how our research impacts communities. For me, the program that I'm lucky enough to lead, and I know Joanna spoke about returning data to communities as part of our work. One of the things that we know is the exclusion from the education system means that there's lots of data that isn't necessarily accessible to Indigenous communities. And so as part of the privilege that I experience, I'm able to access a whole range of administrative data sets or government data sets that includes Indigenous truth, Indigenous data, Indigenous stories within those, and I'm able to return them to communities in ways that communities understand or in ways that communities find valuable. And so we were doing some work with some national data recently, and some things that we might model for or consider include things like education, income, access to traditional lands. And so when we were talking about this and returning those findings to the community, they sort of described this process. So, well, they described this image that we then had to support returning that information. So you can see the sort of healthy, vibrant lungs on the left-hand side, and you can see the colonial machine sort of systematically embedding commercial tobacco use across Australia, including through payment of rations of tobacco. You can see the sort of lever down on education, on income. You can see the button around land, all things that influence one's ability to be smoke-free or otherwise. We know that education, income, experiences of racism, things like that impact smoking prevalence. And so when we were returning this information, this is sort of how the communities were visualising those findings. And so we had this image drawn to reflect that reality and to help work with communities to make sure that the information we were providing was as useful as possible, in addition to your standard journal articles or conference presentations and other things. So thinking about how we can make our research impactful is an important consideration in all the work that we do and how it is centred on communities. Another example I wanted to touch upon and thinking about sort of where we've come as academics is these racialized logics. We commonly sort of see race norming, race conditioning, race correction, etc., and all these terms that might play out in different ways. And so I think it's important to consider how we compare population groups, why we compare population groups, and how that can influence the conversations that we're having, or how it can influence the supports or structures that facilitate that sort of narrative. And so we know, and we've seen different conversations, and this is a bit of street art in Toronto, saying Black Lives Matter, and we've seen calls for this around the world, particularly in recent times. We saw the civil rights movement that had a tremendous impact around the world, including improving access to education for Indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to sort of remind us that we all have a different piece of the puzzle, that we all have different roles in the infrastructure or in the structures that support and give voice to different population groups. And so I guess one of the things I wanted to challenge us to think about as we sort of move forward in this work is around the ways of being, what exists, what is real. We talked about scientific segregation, we talked about hierarchies, we talked about what is objective earlier in this conversation. And so I want us to reflect on, as we move forward, what gives value to, or how do we value ways of being, what exists, what is real. I wanted to acknowledge how we obtain information. If we've had Indigenous people excluded from education systems, The evidence base might be predominantly Euro-Western focused and silence or oppress Indigenous voices. The ways that we work, the ways that we do research, the value and conduct of research might be different. If we're working in a system where, for example, Indigenous voices have been excluded and where research has historically been done on Indigenous people as opposed to by or with Indigenous people, then the ways at which we operate can be different or may require to be done differently. So I know the way that we govern our work, we know that the Indigenous data sovereignty principles that we have to operate within can influence the ways of working. When we talk about returning data to communities, we talk about making sure that we contextualise it appropriately, that those voices are heard, and this can have different structural challenges. I know that for me, it takes a lot longer to ensure that the research that we are doing is contextualised appropriately because the evidence base we are working with has often excluded those Indigenous voices. And similarly, how do we acquire those knowledges? This is a nice tangible example, I thought, that I give from Turtle Island, from North America, where we were able to essentially drive a population health profile using Indigenous community-driven processes, building on strong relationships. And at the end of the study, we were able to show that the Indigenous populations, the First Nations Inuit Métis population living in the urban centre of Toronto, was a lot larger than had been previously captured in the census. And so in releasing that, in doing a media release around that, we had an Indigenous reporter and a non-Indigenous reporter look at the data and come up with two completely different, I guess, headlines or two key points. And so you can see the image on the left, or the front page of the Star, I think it was at the time, sort of highlights that reports say Indigenous people in Toronto are far more likely to be homeless, unemployed and hungry. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the Indigenous reporter says that critical gaps in data about Toronto's urban Indigenous community. So even though both reporters were presented with the same information, the way they engaged with that information was completely different. And then the message and the story that they shared was also completely different. And if I go back to the example around race norming, the example on the left-hand side sort of looks to compare Indigenous people, so far more likely to be homeless, unemployed and hungry. And I guess I'd assume that that's comparing to the non-Indigenous population, even though, again, it was just it was a population profile. So it didn't actually compare Indigenous people to non-Indigenous people. It was just this is what the population profile looks like. And so this is just a little bit more detail around that example. So something that I commonly see and experience in throughout the peer review process will be if I'm doing, say, some research looking at smoking prevalences, can you compare that to the non-Indigenous population, or can you compare that to some other population? And if I think about the slide I showed with 60,000 years crammed into one slide, if I think about the experience of Indigenous people compared to non-Indigenous people in Australia, and the privilege provided to some populations, the conversation and the context in which that is operating is very different. So we're comparing a group that was excluded from the education system, was paid in rations of tobacco, has experiences of, or can have experiences of, intergenerational wealth and well-being that might not be afforded to another population. So if my research question is just to understand smoking prevalence, or if my research question is about us understanding quit attempts, if the focus is on the Indigenous population, why would I try to compare it to another population? And don't get me wrong, there are times when we want to compare, but I think it's really important as researchers that we don't just compare for the sake of comparing. I know the way that, or the advice that our governance committee, our research governance, our executives speak to us is, if we're doing some work on Indigenous populations, then we want to make sure that it is focused on Indigenous populations and not necessarily distracted or using our research to look at other things. So what structures of science perpetuate the centering and privileging of whiteness in tobacco science? And so actually, before I go on, I did want to acknowledge the work that the journal Tobacco Control is doing in making sure that the structures support the understanding of Indigenous, of research and science in Indigenous contexts. So changing the structures that might operate so that, for example, you can speak to the governance operations of an Indigenous project, or you can speak to the way that Indigenous people were engaged and own that data. And one of the reasons for that is ensuring the agency of that work and the sustainability of that work, making sure that we operate in ethical principles. I wanted to touch on this quickly as another example around the way we might privilege certain knowledges. So in Australia, our tobacco control and drug policy more broadly has sort of had three main pillars, being supply reduction, demand reduction, and harm reduction. And I think more recently we've seen this appropriation of the term harm reduction that might privilege or might be defined in certain ways that has excluded Indigenous people's understanding of what might be harm reduction. And again, I want to highlight the diversity of Indigenous peoples, but also the context in which we operate. And so when we're looking at something like a highly addictive product like tobacco or a nicotine product, harm reduction might be very different if we're only looking at the physical harms in comparison to other harms as well. So if I go back to our definition at the start, when I was talking about the health of the individual and the community, when I'm talking about the physical, mental, social, spiritual health and well-being of that person and the community, if we're thinking about the health and well-being of the environment, and we're looking at health as a holistic component, it's important, if we're looking to reduce harms, that we also consider the harms in that holistic understanding. And so one thing that I think we've seen increasingly common is the minimisation of things like addiction or the impact on the environment and other harms that also fundamentally impact the health and well-being of individuals and communities. So why Indigenous government-led research that upholds Indigenous worldviews and builds on those foundations that I've explained has greater potential to provide substantial sustained benefits to communities. They're more likely to have a bigger impact. And there's different ways that we can influence structures to support that type of ethical practice in Indigenous contexts. I spoke about the role of tobacco control as a journal that can influence how we publish and making sure that those groups that have been previously oppressed or more oppressed have voice and have a way to ensure that their voice is heard. But as researchers, as those that might be peer reviewing funding applications, as peer reviewers, as research teams, as institutions, editors, it's important that we have that, that we're aware of that role, of that bias, of the influence that the structures around us have in silencing or privileging certain voices. It's important that we know or understand what we value, what is in the evidence base. It's important that we know and consider if, for example, you're involved in a journal, making sure we know which reviewers we want to engage with, or which reviewers have those areas of expertise, those areas of experience that can benefit science and can benefit Indigenous research in this instance. Because obviously, if you've excluded Indigenous voices, the training space that we're operating in might be, again, biased towards that Euro-Western centric ways of knowing, being and doing. And then the last sort of point here is that the peer review or the evaluation bias, even if we consider that the evidence base is biased towards that Euro-Western aspect, even if we get, say, I might review something, someone who might have Indigenous tobacco control experience, there might be ways, given the nature of the bias, that the peer review process, as I'm reviewing a paper, might also include different biases. So it's important to acknowledge that those biases exist, and how we act on or change those things is incredibly important. So in the last couple of slides, I did want to just wrap up and give us some opportunities for questions. But I did want to highlight some opportunities to do some reading. Joanna mentioned the Ethical Publishing Indigenous Context. I think that's a great article. It's had loads of interest around the world from different journals, including tobacco control, as to how do we improve the structure to support Indigenous research that's advancing the conversation. And so I wanted to obviously highlight that bit of shameless self-promotion. Off-white decentering whiteness in tobacco science also provides quite a nice, fairly short and concise commentary around the nature on which research is undertaken, led by Juliet Lee. Decolonisation of tobacco in Indigenous communities is published in Nicotine and Tobacco Research, led by Dr. Patricia Nez Henderson. And I think it's a really important foundational piece to understand the role of the sacred tobacco plant and the role that the commercial industries have taken in sort of appropriating and changing the way that we engage with that product, or what has now been a commercialised product, but was and continues to be a sacred plant in many places. And then obviously the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control as a important document, but also to highlight that it does explicitly speak to the need to engage with Indigenous peoples in the development, implementation and evaluation of tobacco control. Again, this is a document that recognises the harm that commercial tobacco causes Indigenous people, but also probably recognise those structural challenges that Indigenous people face because of the exclusion from things like the education system. And then obviously the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So in sort of wrapping up and acknowledging the complexity and the environments that we work in, I wanted to leave us with some sort of tangible things to reflect on, and to also acknowledge that as I sort of reflect over the last 5 years or so, and I mentioned that at the start, what on the outside might look like, we have a big idea, someone funds us, we implement it, and then all of a sudden we have low smoking prevalence, or we have an RCT that operates really nicely, or we have a health clinic that is operating seamlessly, and we're getting 80% or 100% smoking status understanding. The reality is it's complicated. So we work really hard, life happens, we have COVID-19, we all move online, and we still have challenges with unmuting or muting ourselves. All those sorts of things happen. We get loads of help. We have Black Lives Matter. We fail a lot. We have, in Australia, for example, Aboriginal deaths in custody. And then what seems like overnight success pops out the end. So I wanted to acknowledge that we do live in a complex environment, and that complexity influences the science that we see published. And so one of the challenges is first recognising that, but then how do we change that, and how do we change the structures that support ensuring that those that have been most oppressed still have a voice. And so I wanted to leave us with a couple of sort of action items or some things to think about. So I tend to try and always critique myself and self-reflect, question the prejudice and biases that we come with. As I start, I acknowledge who I am, where I come from to start with. Not only so you understand who I am, where I come from, and if you need to, you can hold me to account, but also so that you understand where my prejudice and my bias sits in, and how that may influence the research that I undertake. And I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Rhys Jones, who's a Maori researcher, and left me with this quote at World Indigenous Doctors meeting recently in Vancouver, and said, we can't pick our oppressor. If we're going to be anti-racist, we have to be anti-sexist, we have to be anti-ableist, we have to be all of those things. So being aware of and acknowledging those systems of oppression to ensure that we can create safer spaces. Cultural safety is safety, and we can find ways to build Indigenous-led partnerships, because if we're improving the health and wellbeing for Indigenous peoples, we should be improving the health and wellbeing of all people. And then there's a couple of local, national, international documents here, given the expertise and global reach of this discussion today. I thought I'd share a couple of documents that might be useful, including sort of Indigenous data sovereignty principles. There are local protocols and practices I'm sure that you'd be aware of. I'd encourage you to have a look at the ethical publishing Indigenous contexts and look at tobacco control and how we're implementing change to make it a safer space, as well as Moana Jackson's keynote and Paparangi's discussion around valuing Indigenous wisdom, which is also in tobacco control. And so, and here's some references, but I'll leave it there to give us a little bit of time to have any questions. Thanks very much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raglan. That's fantastic. And we already have questions in the Q&A box, so folks, please continue to type your questions and comments there. So our first, I'm just going to jump right in, so we have enough time to hear your thoughts on these issues. So the first question is from, or comment is from Ryan Kennedy. He said he really enjoyed and appreciated your use of art to introduce aspects of Indigenous culture. And can you describe your relationship with artists and what and how you work with artists to integrate art into your efforts to disseminate research findings? And if you could share any thoughts on what or how public health researchers and artists can work more closely together.
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that's probably happened for me anyway, fairly organically in many ways. I think some of the principles that our program operate on include being a tangible benefit to communities. So if we're not, if there's no benefit to that community, then sort of what's the point in us doing the research? And as part of that, we've got to understand what might be useful for me as an academic in sharing something like a peer-reviewed paper in the Lancet or something like that might not necessarily be the best or easiest way for communities to understand the research or the findings or anything. It might even be informed consent. And so what we try to do is, when a community might approach us or ask us to do some work with them, is to ask them sort of understand the research question and other things, the general standard scientific sort of stuff, but also, how do you want this data returned to you? Like, is there do you want a PowerPoint, do you want a fact sheet, do you want infographics, or do you want a peer-reviewed journal article? It might be anything. And I think once we understand, for me anyway, that a lot of the answers actually lie in community, and the community is the person or the people that hold that knowledge. No one knows communities like communities know communities. Then it also opens up opportunities to share information in ways that might have a longer, might have longevity as well. So, the image of the colonial machine, for example, communities loved it, and it resonated with them. It spoke to the stories that they've been speaking about. It spoke to the data from the model that we've been doing at EPI. But basically, they wanted a sticker. They didn't necessarily want a table of numbers. They said, how can we show this to our kids? How can we remind ourselves that, we've always been a smoke-free society or a nicotine-free community? And so actually they wanted a sticker. We toyed with the idea of a magnet. Some communities didn't want magnets because various reasons. But I think opening up to that, we can do it in ways that are very efficient, but can increase the impact that our research has. And then in terms of the relationship, I think I sort of introduced, when I was introducing myself, part of that's around building a relationship and commonality. So the artists that we've worked with and had the privilege of working with generally have an interest in the work that we're doing. Jasmine Sarin, who I mentioned, she was one of the people that started the Aboriginal tobacco resistance movement in Sydney. So she has a long history in that. And so she was able to work with us in that artwork. So I think working with artists can also increase the meaningfulness of actually doing the work as well. And the message can be shared not only through the end product, but through the development and generation of art or sharing of knowledge. So I'll leave it there, but yeah, great question.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is about sharing any experiences you've had working with Indigenous teenagers in particular, to help them with tobacco, I'll say, prevention and cessation.
Yeah, also a great question. And I must say, in Australia, I think we've been very lucky to see young people have, including teens, to have probably our biggest impact so far, both in cessation but also preventing uptake. I think one of the challenges we have is, there's probably a bunch of challenges. One of them is, I think we minimise the fact that in some ways that tobacco is addictive. And when I say we, obviously the tobacco control scientific community is highly aware of the role of addiction, but I think in communities, because the industry has had such a role in influencing the narrative, there's a lot of self-blame that goes on in the communities that I've had the privilege of working with. So people tend to deny that, I'm not addicted, I'll give up when I want to give up, or things like that. And then in terms of cessation, they might not necessarily see cessation support as something for them. And it might be something that adults do or older people do. And similarly, I think the services that tend to be funded are for example, 18 plus, or there might be restrictions on the types of NRT products that are available for 18 plus, and some of those are for legitimate reasons around, in some ways, health and wellbeing. But I think we need to really engage with Indigenous youth, teens, young people, because they also know where they go for support. They know who they speak to. They know who they reach out. And so some of the work we see, particularly around peer-to-peer support or a supportive uncle or auntie, is particularly useful, because the way that teens engage with the health system or engage with cessation supports is very different to the way that we see the general community engaging with those supports. And so I think that diversity is really important to understand and include. And if we can put those Indigenous teens at the centre of that, and we can meet teens where they are at so that they're driving the conversation, I think that's incredibly useful. And then I'll just finish with, on that one anyway, on that question, which is such an important question. Well, actually, I'll finish with 2 points. One is, we're definitely seeing that challenge with the increased targeting around vaping in Australian communities. And we know that schools, teens and others are grappling with nicotine addiction as a result. But there's this thirst for knowledge and understanding about how to quit. So I think being open to and understanding that, and how we meet with them, if it's at schools, if it's outside of schools, if it's youth groups, if it's through social media, then I think that's incredibly important. And the second part that I wanted to just mention is the successes we've seen have been because young people have been promoting essentially smoke-free generations. Like, young people have a different access to education that we might not have had, including access to, well, myself anyway. There are probably young people there that have different experiences, even if I like to think I'm still young. But they've been incredible in terms of how they access information, and that information is not only at your fingertips, it's in your pocket, it's on your phone pretty much 24/7. You can get information. And so we have seen significant declines in smoking prevalence among Indigenous youth. And because the Indigenous population is so young, that's also where we see those massive health gains at a population level. So probably should acknowledge and celebrate youth and young people in that space as well. Hopefully that's useful and answers the question.
Thank you. And let me see if we can get to one, maybe two questions if you have, if it's an easy response, although let's see. So a big thank you for your excellent presentation. Interested in hearing more about your thoughts on how to establish processes for self-reflection at larger scale within scientific institutions or the academy. But how do we ensure that that's meaningfully done and not just a checkbox?
That's an awesome question, and it's something I think we grapple with all the time. We change these structures to support certain things. So, we might have Indigenous research ethics committees or human research ethics committee that have an Indigenous component to it and all sorts of things. I think the reality is some people will use that as a checkbox or have some standard words that they drop into those sections. But I think if we hold each other to account and or try and change those structures to allow us to include enough information to be meaningful and to make assessment sounds a bit funny, but like a more informed judgment around what that looks like, then I think that can help. I think, the ethical publishing Indigenous context is a fairly pragmatic piece that could include short answer questions there, say 100 words or 200 words if we're worried about word count. That can address some of those areas and can help us to understand what meaningful engagement looks like. I think there's some of the ways that we can sort of look to make sure that there is some level of accountability and it's not just a checkbox. The other thing that I tend to talk about is, for me, is communities vote with their feet. If I am using checkbox type material and not meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples, then I won't be welcome back to that community, or that community won't work with me again. And the other thing is, it's a fairly small world in terms of communities will talk to each other and hold us to account. So I think, we have unfortunately a long ongoing history that, research hasn't necessarily been optimal, but I think the more we can challenge institutions, organisations, and also peer back on organisations. I talked about tobacco control, changing the infrastructure there. If that sets the precedent and making sure that that's the standard from now on, I think can help us to minimise that tick box type exercise.
Well, thanks so much. I think we're going to have to leave it here, unfortunately. I know it's super late for you and really appreciate you staying up, getting up to do this and share all your thoughts on this important topic. And I think clearly there's a lot more to come and a lot more thinking and practice, but it's great for you to it's been wonderful that you've educated us on these sort of important principles and the ideas that you've shared, and I look forward to continuing to build on that. So thanks so much for your presentation, Raglan.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks everyone for joining us.